Summit. The next speaker is Tony Riches, and he actually spoke at the very first Tudor Summit, so I'm super excited to have him back. So let me introduce him to you, and then we'll get right into his interview. So Tony Riches is a full-time writer and lives with his wife in Pembrokeshire, West Wales. After several successful non-fiction books, Tony turned to novel writing and wrote Queen's Sacrifice, set in 10th century Wales, followed by The Shell, a thriller set in present-day Kenya. A specialist in the history of the early Tudors, he is best known for his Tudor trilogy, which is fantastic. Tony's other international bestsellers include Warwick, The Man Behind the Wars of the Roses, as well as The Secret Diary of Eleanor Cobham. For more information about Tony, you can visit his website at tonyriches.com, and I'm going to have links here on this page, so click around to wherever the links are. All right, let's get right into the interview with Tony. Well, let's talk about them then. I'm so happy that you are able to talk at the Tudor Summit and that you're able to share. It's the way you've kind of structured this. You've got Mary leading into Charles Brandon, leading into Katherine Willoughby. So
yeah, I can explain it. There is a logic to it, actually.
Let's hear.
Very briefly, I think I told you before that after the success of the Tudor trilogy, which was my big work that I really put all my energies into, there was demand for a kind of sequel to it. Mm-hmm. And I'd really enjoyed writing Mary's story, Mary as a young girl. And so it seemed fairly logical to, rather than end it with the death of Henry, was to pick it up from Henry's death and tell Mary's story, which is a really fascinating story anyway. And of course, that got me researching Charles Brandon, and had no intentions of writing about Charles Brandon. And when I started, I just couldn't get out of my head this image of Henry Cavill in The Tudors. Yeah. I don't know if you saw the television series The Tudors. Out of fairness to Henry Cavill, he did a really compelling job of bringing that character to life. But of course, it was, as these things always are, it was flawed in various ways. And Mary and Margaret had been merged.
Mm-hmm, right.
A bit ridiculous. So that gives you an idea how historically accurate it was.
And she married the King of Portugal, right, instead of the King of France.
Oh, don't let's not go there. That's just going to confuse a whole generation of school children, isn't it? But anyway, I actually, I think I've told you, I went to Westhorpe and I went to St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, and I actually stood at Charles Brandon's tomb, and I really wanted to get a sense of who he really was when I was writing Mary. Mm-hmm. So I gathered all this material together then about his father, who was one of the few people possibly killed by Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. And I had this picture on my wall of that happening. There's a picture done by the Richard III Society. It's quite big actually, of Richard III running William Brandon through with his lance, while he's doggedly holding on to the Tudor standard rather than defend himself. And of course, that's how Charles ended up in Henry's court, because this is Henry VII's court now, in that that was fairly typical that he would reward, it's almost like an act of martyrdom, isn't it? Mm-hmm. He would reward that by taking good care of his sons. Mm-hmm. And Charles Brandon effectively grew up, he was 8 or 9 years older than Henry, but they kind of grew up together. And I've got this theory that Henry VIII actually was envious of Brandon, because when you think about it, Brandon could do whatever he wanted and did, literally. He could go jousting and get drunk and whatever. Whereas at the time, Henry's father ruled him with a rod of iron. He was terrified of anything happening to his son after what happened to Arthur. So he wouldn't allow him hardly to ride a horse even. He kept him in a room adjacent to his own bedchamber and barely let him out. And so when Henry VII died, you can imagine that really let the brakes off, didn't it?
Yeah.
And there was this gang of, it was almost like the Rat Pack, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
The gang of which Charles Brandon was a part.
Yeah.
But even then, Henry had to still be king, and he had to do all the kingly things, and he pretty much had to marry Catherine of Aragon, and Charles Brandon could do whatever he wanted still. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it was fascinating as a writer to, having written the story from Mary's point of view, Mary Tudor's point of view, to then revisit the same story from Charles' point of view. And I gave my editor a real challenge, which was to make sure that there was some read across between the two books. So they both had to stand alone. If somebody just chooses to read one, then they can manage the other one. But also where there was a crossover, it had to be consistent. So the editing took ages. And I did think that was the end of it, because I decided I was going to move on to the court of Elizabeth I and write an Elizabethan trilogy next. And I actually started on that. And then I woke up one morning with the idea that Katherine Willoughby was such an intriguing woman, really. I've been writing about her, of course, because she crops up at the end of Brandon's life in the book. And I suddenly realized that it would provide a link, because Catherine's life goes from the death of Charles Brandon and the death of Henry VIII, right through then Edward, Mary, and then the coronation of Elizabeth I. So what that gives me is a continuous narrative right through from Owen Tudor right through to Elizabeth I, which is amazing, isn't it? So no stone is left unturned in the whole saga, really. But there are two books. I don't know if you can get these to come through on the thing. This is the one which most people know of, which is amazing. I mean, Evelyn Reed, she's not really a historical fiction author. There's a very grumpy picture of Charles Brandon there, looking very old. And I recommend this because it's so beautifully written. It's very evocative, with lots of things of hedgerows and birds tweeting and stuff like that. And the history is actually quite accurate, because her husband gave a lot of help. He was historian. And the other one, the only other book really that is brings another dimension to Catherine's story, is this rather curious thing by David Baldwin, which is all based around the proposition that Catherine could have been Henry VIII's last seventh wife. Yeah. Right. And I'm sorry, but it's really flimsy, the historical evidence. But what a nice idea, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
well, what would have happened to Catherine Parr in order for that to have happened?
Well, there's so many questions it raises. I mean, poor old Henry VIII was, never mind last love, last legs he was on. And, you know, Catherine was only 14 when Charles Brandon surprised her with telling her that he was actually going to marry her himself. He was 49 at the time. And, that gives me some interesting problems, because my own editor, when she was editing Brandon, asked me to tone down the romance a little bit. Yeah. And isn't that an interesting question? When you're what I try to do is be very honest and faithful to the history, and only use fiction to fill in the gaps. But of course, the gaps occur as to what happened once the bedroom door was closed, really. That's generally not covered terribly well. And my sister said to me, you really don't want people reading this with some kind of, for the wrong reasons, you know? Yeah. So I, for once, I never did have, I always had in mind that I could have a YA readership. So in fact, I've had feedback from my books that some school children, particularly in America, use them to improve their understanding of Tudor history, which is quite a responsibility, isn't it?
Yeah.
Compared with television, I think I'm doing quite well, actually. Um, so that's an interesting challenge, and I found a way of dealing with it. And my wife reads each chapter as I write it, with a strict brief that she's to alert me to anything which she thinks needs to be dealt with more sensitively. And then it goes to my editor, who will do the same word by word, line by line. So there's a kind of several layers of censorship going on here.
Yeah. Well, that also, I want to go back and start with Charles a little bit to understand the dynamic, because Katherine Willoughby was in his household at the time, and so they had known each other. But also the idea that in the two, I think we read those things with our 21st century understanding of teenage years and adolescence. And in the Tudor period, they didn't really have you were either a child or you were a grown-up, right? They didn't have like this adolescent.
A modern invention, But there's a few things to understand in that, gosh, where to start? Firstly, Catherine's mother was, of course, Maria de Salinas, who was Catherine of Aragon's lady-in-waiting, who came across as a teenager from Spain and had been around the court for all of Henry's life. And then her father, Lord Willoughby, was a very loyal courtier and a close friend of Charles Brandon. And what I understand to have happened is Mary and Charles had a son who they named Henry. There's lots of Henry Brandons, which is very confusing. So at least 3 that I know of. But the second Henry Brandon, which was the second son of Charles and Mary Tudor, he was made Earl of Lincoln at the age of 2. And Lord Willoughby was present at the time. And I think a deal was struck in that both of them could see the great advantage in that, from the Willoughby point of view, that their son would become the Duke of Suffolk at some point in the future. And from Brandon's point of view, the Willoughbys were significant landowners in the north. So that would cover all of his debts and everything like that. So it was agreed when...
Charles Brandon had a lot of debt, right?
Oh,
I don't want to skip over that bit.
He was amazing that most of the land that he inherited and was given and granted by the king, and even the stuff that came across after the dissolution of the monasteries, was actually belonging to other people. So he had to normally contest it to make sure that he got any income from it at all, which itself cost money. And then after all that, he might find that there are sitting tenants and he can't actually do very much with it, and he gets a little bit of income. And of course, what made it all doable for him was Mary's dower income as Queen of France was a lot of money, and that used to come across quite regularly. And so they did okay while Mary was alive, but once Mary sadly died, that dower income stopped almost immediately. And Charles Brandon was really wondering how he was going to cope. And in fact, Westhorpe had to revert to the crown. And so, he moved to Suffolk Place and he was really travelling on progress with the king most of the time, but Suffolk Place was their base. And although Katherine Willoughby was an heiress, she was actually one of the wealthiest young teenagers, if you like, in England. She didn't actually have a lot of income from that, 15,000 ducats or something like that, and that her uncle was busily contesting that inheritance as well. So for the first couple of years of their marriage, Charles Brandon was doing his best to actually get his hands on Catherine's money. So meanwhile, of course, he was borrowing money not just from the king, but from whoever would lend it to him, and probably at quite high interest rates as well. But it never troubled him, I don't think, and he would have been quite amused to know that after his death, people were astounded at the amount of debts that he had, as such a wealthy man.
Okay, so then let's go back to their striking this deal when his son is being made Earl of Lincoln and
Well,
the
that was straightforward. It was quite typical for children to be betrothed,
yeah.
because that, you know, you played the long game and you planned ahead, and it gave everybody a bit of certainty, didn't it? So they'd have both been very happy with it. But a year later, Catherine's father died, sadly. So she was only 7 then, and she was at Parham Hall with her mother, in fact, on her own a lot of the time, because her mother would be as lady in waiting to Catherine of Aragon. She would have been wherever Catherine of Aragon was.
And
And
what years are we talking here?
oh well, this is the interesting thing, is that by chance, because Catherine was born in March 1519,
Okay.
this is the 500th anniversary of her birth.
Okay.
Isn't that good?
Yeah,
So
yeah. It's almost like you planned that.
well, isn't it funny? If I can get this book finished by the 1st of June, edited, wow, what should we say, end of July, and out by the autumn, yeah, then that'd be good, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And I could make something of the, what do they call it? Is it
Quincentennial, yeah.
500 years is a nice round figure, easy to remember, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it always means when I'm writing about Catherine, I can easily remember how old she is because I just can work it out from that, you know.
Yeah.
But
okay, so she was coming of age then, right at the sort of height of the problems, the great matter.
yeah.
And so her mother probably would have, tell me about what was going on then.
Well, what happened was that Charles Brandon bought the wardship of Katherine Willoughby to secure her for his son, and she moved to Westhorpe with Mary. And Mary's job was to teach her how to become a great lady who could run a household. And of course, at the same time, we had Frances and Eleanor, Mary's other daughters, so Eleanor was exactly the same age as Catherine, so that was very good. And then Frances was a couple of years older and was able to guide her and help her, advise her. So if you think of it, at Parham Hall, they were neighbours, by the way, it was only 30 miles away in Suffolk.
Okay.
Catherine would have been quite lonely there. She would have had her tutors, and obviously she would have had ladies, servants. So what I normally do in this kind of situation, I have one fictional servant that represents all of the servants. And I've called her Alice because Alice is the confidant for Catherine, who is the only person she's got really to speak to, because her mother comes storming back from wherever, spends a little while, and goes off again. You know, that's the way it worked in those days. Yeah. And then Alice would have gone with her to Westhorpe. So, you know, suddenly Catherine goes from being a lonely 10-year-old to having another 10-year-old girl who's much more worldly wise with her. Plus, there's young Henry, who is a kind of slightly spoilt heir to the dukedom of Suffolk. And of course, because Mary Tudor lost his older brother, sadly, and you know, she did tend to indulge him a bit and let him do whatever he wanted. So the way I've read it is that Catherine, although she knew she was supposed to marry Henry, she felt no affection for him whatsoever. It'd be like marrying your brother, you know?
Yeah.
And then, because Charles Brandon cheated really, because although he bought her wardship, he did it in installments, like a hire purchase thing. And I don't know if he ever paid it all back, actually. But that was typical of the time, and we need to remember that it wasn't some awful thing that we should be shocked about or think worse of him. It was actually quite a clever move, because if he didn't buy her wardship, then somebody else would, because Henry VIII didn't used to just hang on to a valuable wardship. He would flog it off to something which would be to his advantage. And of course, Charles had first dibs on it because they were really quite close friends. And, you know, I challenge you to find another relationship that Henry VIII had with anyone at all
Mm-hmm.
that endured for so long.
Right.
There is nobody actually. It's a unique thing. They would have had a very deep understanding of each other's motivation and all the sort of complexity around it.
Yeah.
And of course, Charles was fiercely loyal to Henry. And then when the Great Matter cropped up, it was like taking a pack of cards and throwing them all up in the air, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Because what a dilemma for Mary, first of all, is that her brother, we have to remember that Catherine of Aragon and Mary Tudor, Queen of France, were very close. They'd been thrown together, really, by circumstance. And then to suddenly find that her brother is being really quite horrible to Catherine of Aragon, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, there'd been all sorts of indiscretions which people had just smiled about, which again was acceptable for the time. It was the way kings behaved.
Yeah.
But he'd gone a step further than that, of course. And you've got all these characters. We have to remember Charles Brandon, he didn't come from common stock, but he didn't come from one of the great old families that came across with William the Conqueror. And they used to call him the stable boy because he was master of the horse. And worse, I should think, you know. And to his face as well. And I'm thinking of people like Thomas Howard, Norfolk. In particular, Brandon's ancestors used to be servants for the Norfolk family, and he never let him forget it. And then, of course, Norfolk finds that his niece, one Anne Boleyn, is suddenly in the pole position, and he would really make the most of that, wouldn't he? And poor Charles, he's in a three-way split because he's got his loyalty to the king, which overrides any other consideration, including his own life, I think, because several times he risked his life for the king. Then he's got his loyalty to his wife's feelings, which is very much a secondary thing, but still very real to deal with, isn't it? And his loyalty to Catherine of Aragon, because of course he'd known her as long as he could remember. You know, I don't think they were close friends, but he would have certainly felt more sympathy for her than for Anne Boleyn. And part of the reason was that Anne Boleyn's family were an old landed family. Don't let anybody say Anne Boleyn didn't come from noble stock. The Boleyns really saw Brandon as a potential blockage that might need to be removed at some time. So they were constantly watching out, just waiting for him to make any kind of mistake, and then they would pounce, and that would be the end of him potentially, which is quite shocking, isn't it? It's I think there's a wonderful film to be made about all of that, you know what I mean? Which would make the television Tudors look like a pale shadow by comparison, because we all know what happened, of course, and sadly, Henry VIII exploited Charles, made him do things like he sent him with Thomas Howard to tell Catherine of Aragon that she must no longer call herself queen. And by the way, can we have the royal crown jewels? Because somebody else needs them. And can you imagine what that felt like for Charles Brandon, to be the one to tell her? And it's said that she shouted at it. She took it badly, by the way. She shouted at him and called him a traitor and all this kind of thing. And then one step removed from that, you've got Katherine Willoughby trying to make sense of it all.
Yeah.
She's not.
So let's talk about, I want to, because I want to move into Catherine's story then too, and talk about, we've got this proposal, and she was quite famously a Protestant then. I mean, as it was hard to quantify Protestant, nobody was really a Protestant at that point, but can we talk a little bit about how she would have perhaps seen this, and whether she was a reformer, that she's only a girl or
where I am at the moment, because I'm actually researching this at the moment.
Okay.
Where I am is that she starts off as an absolute dyed-in-the-wool Catholic. Her mother is the champion of Catholicism, the Spanish model of Catholicism, which is the kind of extreme, if you like, interpretation of it all.
Mm-hmm.
And the Pope's word is sacrosanct and everything like that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where she starts.
I live in Spain, and it's still like that.
Yes, of course. And well, sometimes I think that in the parallel history, it would have been quite nice if that was just the way that it carried on, but never mind. If you imagine then that she was quite a feisty girl in that she used to talk back to her mother and challenge everything. And I've tried to, there's quite good evidence for that, by the way, in her letters. And you know, she felt able to argue back with Henry VIII. Not many people felt that they could do that, you know. And certainly poor Charles Brandon got a bit more than he bargained for, because he was expecting this meek young girl that would do his bidding and basically give him another son and things like that. And instead he's got this really quite a woman with her own mind, you know what I mean, and a very modern woman. As I read more about her, I realised that she'd be perfectly capable of coping in today's world, because if she can stand up for women in Tudor times, which, you know, other women did as well. Mary Tudor herself, you know, did quite a lot speaking out against Anne Boleyn, for example. Took a lot of courage, didn't it? Although she was protected slightly by being the king's sister. But Katherine Willoughby wasn't, you know, in quite such a privileged position. And I suppose, because of course her mother spoke out against Anne Boleyn and paid the ultimate price for that. I mean, she went into hiding and she was banned from seeing Catherine of Aragon. Very sad time for her. If you think after, you know, she was 13 or 14 when she first met Catherine, and now she's sort of in her mid-40s and it's all going horribly wrong. But to go back to the Protestantism, the way I've dealt with it, when I visited Westhorpe, I went to the church in Westhorpe village, which is a beautiful little Norman church, and it's where the Brandon family would have gone on special occasions. They had their own chapel in the manor house, but it was important for them to be seen by the people, so they would have arrived in grand procession. And Catherine is looking at the blank-faced parishioners who are having to listen to this priest lecture them in Latin and repeating stuff by rote, and realizes they don't understand a bit of it really, you know. The pageantry has kind of overtaken the meaning of it, and that's the beginning of her challenge to Catholicism. And then of course she starts to tap into some of the great thinkers who also are like-minded. And of course when the king declares himself the head of the Church of England, then that's kind of an opportunity to look fresh at it all. And it's really interesting because then it toggles, doesn't it? Because after Henry VIII dies, then Mary comes in. So sorry, we've got Edward. Yeah, we've got Edward. But I was thinking of when Mary comes in, then poor Catherine is done for because she's already spoken out then, and there's persecution, and
she had to flee and everything.
Yes, oh yes, her life was at stake because she was almost seen as a spokesperson in some ways for the more radical Protestantism. And you know what, I think she was encouraged before Mary came to the throne, and then perhaps she might have feared for, you know, her sons and everything like that, because it was a very dangerous time. And
so can we talk, before we get to that, I want to talk about her relationship with Catherine Parr and that incident where Stephen Gardiner tried to bring Catherine Parr down, and she had a dog called Gardiner, right? And
it's documented, because I wondered whether that was myth, you know, because it's a nice story, isn't it? Yeah. And it's documented that she used to criticize Gardiner within his earshot. And there's a famous story that they were at a ball and they had to each choose their favourite partner. And she chose Gardner. She said that she couldn't see anybody else who she would choose. So she thought she would choose her least favourite person as a partner. And I think, I still haven't actually found evidence that she had a dog named Gardner, but definitely there was a feud going on. And that's going to be fascinating to get to the bottom of. There aren't, with Mary, there are Erin Sadlap's book of letters. So there's all of Mary's surviving letters with analysis of them, plus quite a few replies. I've only got a few actual letters from Catherine, but there's enough to give a sense of the sort of person that she was.
She sounds like she kept the feisty Spanishness from her mother.
Yes, and her father was quite a well-educated, clever courtier, went to France on behalf of Henry to fight his battles and things like that, and could hold his own as a wealthy landowner. So she's an interesting, she's kind of like the new British, isn't she? You know, half European and half old school British. And it's such a modern thing, that whole idea, isn't it? You know? And
so can you tell me a little bit about that for people who don't necessarily know what happened and how she was involved in the Catherine Parr, the plot against Catherine? She was quite, she was like hiding things and everything like that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for Catherine Parr because she was an author for a start, so there's a connection. And I recently read C.J. Sampson's book, you know, in the Shard Lake series.
Yeah, I love him.
It's a very evocative picture of it all. Is it Lamentation, the book?
I forget which one it is. I read it so long ago, but it's one.
I reread it because of what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's fascinating how they were, it's quite hard to remember that people were risking their lives for their beliefs, for their faith. But in terms of how the relationship between Catherine and the Queen is just an intriguing one, because of course it's not properly documented. So this is where, as a historical novelist, what I'm able to do is to capture as much of the known facts as I possibly can, and then try and infer the rest of it.
Right.
And I try and put that in an author's note at the end where necessary, but I try not to, I don't actually have to make very much up, because like I've said, servants and things like that are obviously not recorded, or rarely recorded, but they were always present. But the hiding things and the secrecy and all of that, once again, that has to be inferred and understood, and you know, like the conversations that they might have had between each other.
I think I feel like I remember in Janet Wertman's book, The Path to Summer, she has Charles Brandon being involved in warning Catherine Parr about this risk against her, partially through, can you tell me a little bit about
well, if you imagine what it must have been like to be Charles Brandon, it's like walking a tightrope sometimes, isn't it? Because one slip and you could be dead, basically. And although it sounds a bit extreme, when I'm talking about a slip, I'm talking about something which his enemies could charge him with as being treasonable.
Right.
And, you know, in those days, even talking about the possible death of the king was treason. You know, it wouldn't have to be very hardcore treason, and you'd end up in the Tower of London waiting to be executed, basically. So what he had on his plus side was he had his own loyal following, so he was quite well connected. He had this strange on-off relationship, first of all with Wolsey, and then after Wolsey's days with Cromwell. And, you know, once again, there's the documented history of their relationship, but there's what probably happened as well. And you can imagine he's forever getting unwanted advice, Brandon is, because Cromwell would have summoned him probably on a weekly basis and warned him, can you tell your wife to keep quiet, and all this kind of stuff, and Brandon was a very proud man as well, and I almost feel he's the last of the chivalric Tudor knights, because although there are other people that could have the claim to being Tudor knights, they weren't champion jousters, and they didn't ride against the best jousters in France and win, and they didn't grow up with Henry VIII either. So I think that his values were of a different age. He wasn't a skilled politician.
Yeah.
He wasn't actually terribly bright, I think, sometimes, because even Wolsey, I say even Wolsey was very bright, but Wolsey, you always had the edge over him. You always owed Wolsey money, and Wolsey would come up with these brilliant schemes where you do this for me and then I'll lend you some more money, without realizing that he was just like getting deeper and deeper and deeper into Wolsey's debt, But Cromwell was very different, of course. Thomas Cromwell was a political animal, really, and able to see the Henry's Court like a game of chess, where he's thinking several moves ahead and looking at possible attacks and all those kind of things. So the whole thing is fascinating, really, and it's easy to take an oversimplified view of it, when in fact it's horribly complex, because there are so many people that have everything to gain or everything to lose, depending on the whim of the king. Almost.
Yeah, and he was constantly going back between more Catholic and more Protestant and all of that. So can we talk about a little bit, just continuing Catherine's story? After Brandon died, she remarried, right? And then she remarried a Protestant. And can you tell me a little bit about that?
This is where it gets really interesting, because who'd have thought that she would have ended up penniless in exile with only the clothes on her back, knocking on doors, asking somebody to take her in, and on the run, basically, because they never knew they could knock on a door of somebody that was their enemy and was an informer. It's almost like the French resistance in the Second World War, in that it was a resistance movement. So
did she go to Switzerland then?
Sorry?
Did she go to
I'm in the process at the moment of tracing her steps, and it's quite well documented. But they basically went from one place in hiding to another. And this chap, Bertie's quite a fascinating character, because he was not of noble birth. He was basically a servant, and who'd worked his way up and done quite well for himself. And then how that story actually works out is really quite fascinating. And I actually read somewhere that Katherine Willoughby is a candidate for being one of the most intriguing Tudor women, and she's got a lot of competition for that, isn't she? But, it's when you think there are only really these two books. Going into any detail, she crops up all over the place, but I've yet to find anywhere where her whole story is told authentically, without having to, like I said, David Baldwin, the way he's done it is he's brought in this whole idea of her being Henry VIII's seventh wife, which is quite fun, and the history in this is very good, by the way. So that's reassuring, isn't it? But the other book, the one by Evelyn Reed, was written in the 60s and has got a 60s slant on it. So it's interesting to wonder what how what's happening in Europe at the moment is influencing what I'm reading into all of this, because I
Yeah.
keep seeing parallels. I keep seeing points of common ground.
Yeah. Then the other thing I know about Katherine Willoughby is how she lost her sons on the same day.
Ah, dreadful. Well, this whole thing about the sweating sickness, I'm glad we don't have it today, not that I know of anyway, because it used to, what would happen, it was different to the plague. They don't really even they keep changing their mind how the plague was transmitted, don't they? They're saying it was fleas and stuff like that, but they're not even sure of that now. But the sweating sickness used to arrive suddenly, and it would take half the population of a town, and young and old, rich and poor, it didn't matter what. And basically, once you got it, it started off with cold-like symptoms, and then you could be dead within the day. Terrifying, And what happened was that Catherine's sons were at university, and they decided that's quite a dangerous place with lots of people coming from all over the place to the university. You're asking for trouble. Let's move them to safety. So they moved them out to the countryside and thought they were safe, breathed a big sigh of relief, to an area where there was no sweating sickness whatsoever. And then it came breezing through, and they both died on the same day. Can you imagine what that must have been like? The only positive that I can think of out of it all was that Charles Brandon went to his grave thinking that his succession was secure. He had an heir and a spare, which is more than his mate Henry did. And, he thought it was all sorted. He would have died knowing that. And of course, he couldn't have been more wrong. But I've still got to decide how I'm going to deal with that from Catherine's point of view, because it'd be quite easy to be over sentimental about it. But for any mother to lose both of her young sons in the prime of their life, for such a needless, futile thing as the sweating sickness is horrifying, isn't it?
It's terrible. It's awful.
But she weathered through it and came out the other side. So
yeah. Well, so I want to give you a chance to talk about your books then, and where people can get your books and everything like that. But before we do that, just what kind of note can you leave us on with Katherine Willoughby? Like, what's an overall kind of impression or words to describe her?
If you think of her as a very modern woman in a Tudor world, it's almost like she traveled back in time with what we know now, because she had lots of nerve and courage, and was not at all thrown by being married to Charles Brandon, because she just adjusted to it. That's what you did in those days. You didn't make a big fuss. You just got on with what you could, And, it must have been hard for her with Eleanor, who was her friend, suddenly became her stepdaughter, who was the same age. And Frances, who was her friend, became her stepdaughter. She was 2 years older than her, And they wouldn't have thanked her for that, would they? They would have held her somewhat culpable for it all. But if you think of her as a woman whose story really does deserve to be told and better understood, I think that sets down the gauntlet for me, doesn't it, as a writer, to try and do her story justice. And that's where I am now, is to try and really understand how all these complex events must have seemed to her. But at the end of the book, we have the coronation of Elizabeth I. And she must have felt that she'd been a bit vindicated in terms of her beliefs. And so I haven't decided exactly where I'm going to finish, but I'm then planning to go straight on into the court of Elizabeth I, and by looking at Elizabeth through 3 of her different courtiers.
Perfect. So you're doing these things kind of trilogies.
Yeah, well, I didn't write anything about Henry VIII, but if you think, I've covered his birth, all of his marriages and his death by the time I finished, and without ever writing a book about it. But,
so you've got, so Mary's coming this autumn, we hope, if all goes according to plan. And then you've got Brandon and Mary, Katherine is coming this autumn. Then you've got Mary and Charles Brandon already. And then just tell me where people can buy your books and everything like that.
They're all on Amazon. Okay. So if you just type in Tudor Trilogy or Tony Riches into any Amazon site, then you should find me. I'm having them translated into Spanish as we speak, and Italian. That's a whole new market. They're all available as audiobooks as well. And it's all on my website, which is tonyriches.com.
Okay, we'll put a link there. And you're also very active on Twitter, aren't you?
Yes, I was an early adopter when Twitter first came out. And it still astounds me now that people like Donald Trump are using Twitter as their main form of communication. When I started off, I couldn't even work out what the point of it was. But there's quite a lively readership, and when a new book comes out, I find it a useful way of getting feedback and ideas on what I might do next and stuff like that. So I quite enjoy. I spend a couple of minutes a day on Twitter.
Cool. So we'll put all the links around this video. And thank you so much. I want to be conscious of the time, and you've been very generous with your time and sharing your knowledge, and we'll put links to all your books so people can go buy your books. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and for being here for a second time at the Tudor Summit.
Yeah, well, I'll come back and speak again once I start on the Elizabethan court.
Perfect. Awesome.
Okay.